Linda, I think you joined the BBC just aged 18.
I think I just had my birthday up or something like that, and I'd wanted to join the BBC for years and years and years since I was very small. And most people remember me as a sort of 5-year-old sitting on a stool watching the television. And that we were very lucky as a family to have a television. So that would be late 40s.
Really?
And
That early?
early, yeah. Andy Pandy, who supposedly his outfit was made from a pair of knickers in the colour of our school uniform, where Maria Bird used to teach eurythmics, and that it was one of our school uniforms that were turned into Andy Pandy's outfit. Anyway, I eventually went to see how I could possibly join the BBC. I wanted to be a floor manager, and the BBC kindly gave me an interview, and I could either go to drama school for 3 years, do a couple of years in rep, and then possibly a year as a floor assistant, and then I might be able to get in as an AFM, work my way up that way.
Can I just
Yeah.
stop you there, because this is very interesting. You obviously had exposure to the BBC quite a lot. You said you were watching it when you were very young, but you must have had some experience of drama or something like that at school to give you the sort of interest.
Well, I was still at school, and after I left school, and while I was secretarying, I did what I call amateur hystericals, and one of the local societies, all their members seemed to be 40 plus, and they were desperately looking for Juves, and I was somehow caught up in that and did sort of amateur acting and producing for a number of years down in South London and Beckenham, just in Kent. It was a good experience, and it certainly taught you how to do props and things like that.
Yes.
So at least I had that behind me. But when the time came to make the decision, it was an easy one, because as a family we didn't have any money to keep me for all those years, and I would have had to have kept myself while at drama school. So I took the easy way out and learnt shorthand typing and got a job after seeing a lady in Portland Place who took me on. The time then, it was really the end, I think, of the old days of the BBC, because one still dressed in a suit and wore, I think one even wore stockings in those days. I think I was just on where they went to tights. It was very much the boss and the secretary. You didn't work together, as it were, the way a lot of people do these days. It also, I think it was a good idea, because while I was doing it, I kept my eyes open and learnt an awful lot about the BBC. But I was very lucky that I did work for a number of the old school. I actually worked for Cecil Madden for a couple of weeks.
Ah, yes. Now, I wanted to ask you about him, because
Yeah.
he was at Alexandra Palace, I think, in the very early days of television. So,
Indeed.
I mean, you've got a contact right back to the beginning of television there.
Well, that's what I felt, and I felt really sort of honoured in a way. And he was a real gentleman, up on the 6th floor at Television Centre, and sadly it was the time when his old pal Cecil McGivern, I think he died in a house fire or something. So there was all that going on while I was there, and then. Did at one time work for Sidney Newman as his second secretary. So I got a little look at drama.
Can you remember your first days and where you went initially? You didn't
Yes.
go straight into drama, did you?
No. First off, you went. The only training I ever got at the BBC, you went to the secretarial training course, which was a week at Marylebone Road, up in an attic somewhere with a big glass roof to it. And it was like a schoolroom, and you learnt how to address envelopes in BBC style. All I remember there is they had a lift which was operated by a rope, which I think means it was worked by some sort of water system. But anyway, it felt very old, if you know what I mean.
Yes. The BBC seemed to go in for eccentric lifts. I think you were there at the Langham too. The Langham had an eccentric lift system.
Oh, that was a wonderful building, because I went there for programme correspondence section. Yeah. And it was right on the top floor. And you looked out right down Portland Place. And there were a whole load, I don't know if I'm correct, but I seem to remember older ladies, possibly war widows, I don't know, sort of ladies of a certain age answering all these letters. And then we were sent there to type out the answers. In the end, they just gave me a pile of letters and said, answer them. But they were things like, what's the theme music to The Archers, or you know, that sort of thing.
So you had to do research, really, to answer them.
I think that's quite a well, I suppose it's correct, but it sounds a rather grand word for looking in the files, because they were usually questions that had been answered before. But the strangest thing there, I remember, was one morning sitting at my desk, and this chap walked past the window, and this is on the 7th floor. And it was only then when I looked out, I realised there was a ledge, and it was covered in pigeon shit. And he was sweeping all that off. I hate to think what was happening down below. I thought, my godfathers, if he falls... I don't think the BBC had heard of health and safety in those days. But it was certainly strange, I'll say that to it.
Were there a lot of very eccentric letters? I mean, written in green ink. You tend to think of the, disgusted of Tunbridge Wells.
Possibly if they were opinions, they were sent to the programme department to have a look at. But no, I don't remember the letters at all, other than being in an awfully large pile to get through before the end of the day.
Yes, right. Were you expected to have, very high secretarial skills, or do you think you got appointed because of your character, as it were?
I don't know. Possibly both. I went for a term at the Regent Street Polytechnic, or as it's now called Westminster University.
Yes, just across the road. Mm.
That's it. And got shorthand and typing up to the necessary speeds. I think that was the main thing. Could you type fast enough? And could you take down shorthand fast enough? Which was absolutely pointless, because most men, when they're dictating, dictate at half the speed, well, women too, I expect, half the speed that you are actually required to have. So that was okay.
So you moved from the Langham to Television Centre, which was presumably being half built.
It had been built, not the news section down by the shop, as it was then. Well, that was a bit later. I worked at Ken House when they were still building Kensington House. At the other end, it was built on an old railway line, which is why it's such a long, thin building. No, with the secretarial side of it, the first job I was actually sent on from this secretarial course, this initial secretarial course, was to work in the press office, which was absolutely crazy, because there was me, brand new, sitting answering press inquiries with another girl opposite me, lovely lady called Pam Pyre, who'd been an assistant to Michael McClearmore, the actor, in her youth. And Norma Gilbert was the press officer. And then you see in the paper, a spokesman for the BBC said, and you realise, my godfathers, that was me. And I thought it was awfully, latterly I thought it was really very dangerous having somebody with so little knowledge answering the phone like that. And it wasn't secretarial in any way.
Right. Anything particularly memorable you had to deal with?
No, for once I think it was it was just busy. There were no great disasters or anything like that. whereas other things did happen. I went to work in planning at one time. This is on the sort of rota of secretarial reserve.
Yes.
And the Pope, I think, did the Pope die or was it Winston Churchill? One or the other of them, or probably both. So that turned all the schedules upside down, and that was quite fun, seeing people running around trying to organise things. I thought, well, this is all good, but I want to be a production secretary. And I managed somehow to get on what was called the production panel as a trainee production secretary. Of course, that was at Television Centre, whereas the other secretariat reserve was anywhere. It was Broadcasting House, Bentinck House, don't know whatever happened to Bentinck House, and Television Centre. So that was quite fun. But when I went on the production panel as a trainee production secretary, I was sent to Sportsview, which of course then was a live programme on Wednesday evenings at I think 9 o'clock. It was up to the news at 9 o'clock or whenever the news was. And so I went, I think the first week I went there and sat behind the girl who was doing the job to watch what she had to do. Mm-hmm. And the second week she didn't turn up. I think she was sick or something.
Right.
And you're on. It was one of those jobs with two stopwatches, one for the overall timing and one for the individual items. And knowing you had to come out on time or else you'd be cut off and the producer would lose his credit. And you wouldn't be in anybody's good books then because it cut out for the news at 9 o'clock, which had to be done.
Sacrosanct, yes.
Indeed, yes.
How interesting. You were thrown in at the deep end into the gallery.
Exactly. I couldn't believe it. Scared the living daylights out of me. I managed it for 13 weeks. Don't ask me how. And then they said, did I want the job permanently? And I said, no, thank you. And I'd seen, I really knew nothing about sport. And I know there was one interview and I was saying, who is this chap? And they said, oh, he's captain of the English cricket team or something like that. I should have known. And we had Henry Cooper came in after he'd had his fight with Cassius Clay and things like that. Yes. So you did see quite a few people. But I said, no, I don't want to go on with this. And they said, well, it's not actually production, but we want you to go and work for Aubrey Singer, who was head of outside broadcast documentary features programmes, yes. HOBFS Tel. And so just for a while, I went as his first secretary, and I had a junior secretary working for me, and I was 20 because I had my 21st birthday working in his office.
Now, Aubrey was a very big figure. I mean, he was a very important figure. Became a controller of BBC Two, I think, didn't he?
That's it. I really liked him, but nobody wanted to work for him. I think that's why I got the job.
Why was that? Why didn't they want?
Well, he was tended to sort of shout and leap around and do things in a hurry, and I just ignored it. And I always remember the first day I went there, and I got in about 15 minutes early in the morning to make sure I was ready for dictation and everything. And of course, the minute you get in the door to your office, you hear the voice come through the wall, come on, Linda, bring in your book. I want to do some dictation. So you absolutely scurry round, taking your coat and hat off and everything to get in there. After about the third day, I thought, this is ridiculous, because I was getting in earlier and earlier to get myself sorted. So anyway, the next day when he yelled out, I went in with my coat on and my hat, which was actually a crash helmet and a duffel coat, because I rode a motor scooter across London. And he said, oh, when you're ready, Linda. And after that, it was magic. And we just hit it off. I don't know what it was, It worked well.
What was he doing at that time? What sort of things were you preparing?
He was setting up programmes with Russia, and he'd go to Moscow with Andrew Wiseman, and he said we always used to go into one of the hotel rooms and we'd sit on the bed and we'd talk to the microphones we were sure were in the rooms, and we'd say, you know, my name is, we're here from the BBC and we have a lovely bottle of scotch in the room, and if you'd care to join us, you'd be very welcome. So that was that.
He never got anyone coming in asking for a drink.
No. But and he also, I think, went to Novosibirsk, the sort of science city out in Siberia and places like that. And the other thing, he didn't like being interrupted in meetings. If he was having a meeting in his office and, you know, people were champing at the bit to speak to him or something. But I discovered he didn't mind if I had to stick my head round the door and say, New York on the line for you, Aubrey, or something like that, or Moscow on the line for you. But in those days, I don't know how long it went on. We had tie lines to New York on the telephone, so you could book a call, and you got put through to the New York office. And if you didn't immediately get the person, you could be cut off. So you'd get through to the office of the person you wanted to speak to, and then they'd say, oh, I'll go and get whoever it was. And then you chat frantically with the other secretary at the other end to keep the line open. So I learned quite a bit about New York, which was lovely because he did a programme to celebrate the anniversary of VE Day. It must have been the 20th anniversary of VE Day. And I went to New York on a BBC club flight, which was to Montreal, and we went on a bus all round everywhere, ended up in New York. And he said, oh, well, if you're in New York, go and see my friend. So when I went up to the office, it was a chap called Fred Friendly, who I think is quite well known since.
Oh, yeah.
And in his office was Walter Cronkite and Eisenhower. So I didn't actually see them, but my coat hung on the same row of pegs as an ex-president. So that was something. You felt he was doing something, if you know what I mean.
Yes, he was always busy, and he was setting up new departments, wasn't he?
Wasn't it, and a lot of new programmes.
Particularly science, if I remember rightly.
That's it, yes, and getting in a lot of new people who then became well-known producers of science programmes. That was their first, you know, how they started off there. It was good fun for them, I think. They liked the get up and go feel of the place. And of course, that was a time, as I mentioned earlier, when they were building the back end of Kensington House. Wasn't quite finished, but no, it was good fun doing that. Oh, I did once, they wanted some film brought back from Switzerland. Andrew Wiseman had been filming a programme in Italy and Switzerland, and with Chris Bonington, the climber, and they knew they would be finishing on a certain day in Italy and wanted the film back in London as quickly as possible. And everybody seemed to be away. So I got sent out, and I arrived in the evening in Switzerland, in just north of Interlaken, in Kleiner Scheidegg, opposite the Eiger North Wall. Waited for them to arrive in the evening to collect the film from Italy. And blow me down, they'd missed the customs in those days at the Italian border, and had to wait overnight to get through the next morning. So the next morning, I actually went out and did some filming with them on the mountainside while Chris Bonington talked about climbing up the north wall of the Eiger, and then leapt on a train to Zurich and back to London to get the film back in time for whatever they wanted to do with it the next day. It makes you appreciate how lucky we are now, and having instant reports from the Ukraine and places like that, whereas before it was all in a can.
Yes, and woe betide you if you lost it.
Exactly. Or got lost anywhere to do it.
This was the time when the BBC was about to open BBC Two. I mean, I
Yes.
presume they were preparing for that. So I imagine there was a lot going on in terms of thinking of new ideas and planning for the future. Were you aware of that with Aubrey?
Yes, there were. I think that's why they were getting in so many new people, probably going for people who they thought had good ideas to build it up. I think I'd actually left him when BBC Two started, the famous night that went dark. But I lasted about 18 months with Aubrey before I wanted to get back to doing drama, which is, what I set out to do. Because in my opinion, what I loved about television drama was that you did very long takes, you'd almost call them now, but you'd record a whole scene so that you'd get actors reacting to each other. Whereas nowadays, if you're doing film, a lot of the time you tend to do all the shots on one person and then all the shots on the other. It's much more broken up.
Yes.
Even though I think with video it's a lot better. But I just loved the big scenes. And I did a play once, I was floor managing, and it had a scene about 30 minutes long, which was absolutely electrifying. And at the end, when I said, thank you, the studio was absolutely still for about 30 seconds, it seemed. It was a really long time. And then somebody started clapping because it had been so brilliantly done. It was lovely on that.
Now, in those days, you were getting really big names in for drama, people who were, well known on the London stage and so on.
I don't think I really appreciated how lucky I was to be working with people of the calibre we got at that time. I mean, one of the first studio plays I did was with Jack Hawkins. It was called The Trial and Torture of Sir John Rampayne. And Jack Hawkins had a lot of trouble with, I think it was cancer of the throat. And,
yes, he did, didn't he? Yes.
And this was, in fact, the last thing he did with his own voice. And I was the little AFM. And it was a very complicated show, AFM-wise, with props and things. And at the last minute, they said that they changed the running order so that they could do a scene with him in it, then give him a rest, do another scene, and then do another one. And I remember him coming in, must have been into the prop room or something, and saying, look, they've given me these pills. It says, take one before acting. He said, wouldn't it be wonderful if you could just take a pill and you could do a brilliant performance or something like that? And I kind of thought afterwards that is the sort of person who is just a marvellous example, really, that all the trouble he had, and he was still worrying and looking after everybody and not making a big song and dance about it.
Yes, he had cancer of the throat, didn't he? And
That's it.
And then went on acting afterwards. But I don't know how they managed to do that.
Well, they got other people to voice him. If you see a later film, you'll find on a credit somewhere it says voiced by. Yeah. I'm not quite sure who. But in this play, he was playing opposite a young lad who used to turn up to rehearse on his bicycle, called Ian McKellen. I don't know what happened to him, but
did you get people of the calibre of Gielgud or people like that?
They were around. I worked with Celia Johnson, and then a young Glenda Jackson and a young Helen Mirren, and people from film, Denham Elliott. They just, if you wanted somebody to take part in a drama, the world was your oyster, or rather Spotlight, the book giving all the actors details in it. That was your oyster. You could basically choose anyone. It was amazing. And of course, the units in drama department then were just 4 people. who actually made the programme. You had a producer and a script editor as well. But basically it was down to a director, a production manager, who was also the floor manager, an assistant floor manager, and the production secretary or production assistant. All these names all changed. It was always a bit difficult. But the secretary did all the costing, and the production manager did the casting of extras and all that side of it. Didn't have accountants or casting directors or runners or anything like that in those days.
So a relatively small number of credits at the end compared with today.
Or no credits, because I worked on Ken Loach's first, I think it was his first programme, was Up the Junction. We filmed it. And at the end of that, I think he got a credit, the script editor got a credit. I'm not even sure the cameraman got a credit, but I mean, they were certainly, the PA didn't in the early days or anything like that. So it was very quick at the end. When you were an AFM, you were often sent out as a second AFM to A, help out, and B, learn the ropes. And it was a very good show to work on because there was so much going on. And it was all in London, so there were no nice hotels overnights or anything like that. But because I lived in London. And Up the Junction, of course, was, I think it was the first television that Ken Loach did. It was the one before Cathy Come Home. So he was quite new to it. Was a lovely man to work with, very quiet, very studious. And we did all the filming in London, round and about Clapham Junction, and a lot of which has now disappeared, of course, redeveloped, and you wouldn't recognise. And also how things change. I remember we had a hearse going round, and I was taking it somewhere, so I was sitting in the front of the hearse. We had a coffin in the back, and as we drove through Clapham, the number of men at the side who took their hats off as we went by is amazing. Of course, now people don't wear hats even. So.
And I remember, yes, lots of things that used to happen.
Yeah.
This was with Ken Loach. Now, Ken Loach, you say, was very quiet and very pleasant, but where did his personality work when he was directing?
I don't know. Somehow it did. He just talked away, and
so he had a quiet dignity, but he was very obviously in charge.
Yes, I've seen him interviewed fairly recently, and he's just the same. And I can see why all of his films are all so interesting, that he believes in them so much.
Yeah.
He puts his heart into them. I think that's what it is.
Yes. Did you work on Cathy Come Home as well?
No, I didn't.
Right,
no.
Okay.
But we had great fun pushing supermarket trolleys around Clapham Junction with various things in them, including the cameraman, Brad Fano, at one time for a tracking shot. Supermarket trolleys are marvellous for tracking shots, I must say. Yeah. We did some pub inserts or something at one time, but we filmed in a chocolate factory in Acton, and we filmed the motorcycle accident on Crystal Palace Parade in South London. And we filmed in a swimming pool somewhere near there because one of the actors went and dislocated his arm when he jumped in the water. And so as the AFM, I was sent to take him off to the local casualty department at King's College Hospital and spent an interesting hour or so sitting in casualty, as it was, I think, called then, not A&E, waiting to get him looked after. But that all worked out, so it was good.
Now, listen, I did a few dramas, and one had an AFM, and they were fantastically important. They were attached to you. Sometimes they were attached to you for many weeks. Tell us what the AFM does.
Well, an awful lot. Basically, when you join the team, it's like an ASM in the theatre, except that you're assigned a rehearsal room. And for a play of the month, it was 3 weeks rehearsal. And for a 30-minute theatre, it was 1 week's rehearsal and in between. And the rehearsal room early on could be a drill hall or a church hall or something like that in London. And you would go out there, and the day before you would mark up the floor with all the sets, and you would have a plan you were given by the designer with all the measurements on it. So you then had to mark them up accurately on the floor with the coloured tape, so that the actors could get a good idea of where the sets were. And you also had to order up rehearsal room furniture, which were the oldest sofas and tables you could possibly imagine. And a couple of posts in stands would be a doorway. And for some reason, if you had a double bed, they seemed to manage to get the heaviest double mattresses you could ever find anywhere, until somebody put them onto foam. Then that was a lot better. But the awful thing was that in a lot of these rehearsal rooms, the owners of the room wanted the rooms in the evening. So at the end of rehearsal, you had to hide all the furniture away, either at the side of the room or even in a cupboard under the stage or something like that. It was physically quite hard work. And then you would rehearse with the actors, and you would be on the book, in other words, prompting, and also taking down all the moves they made, so that the director had those in his mind when he was putting his cameras wherever he wanted to get whatever shots he wanted. And also, of course, making coffee in the various breaks and calling the actors for the next day when they'd worked out, what order they were going to rehearse things in.
Just a minute. You would have a white rehearsal script, would you? Not a yellow one, because that was
white.
Studio.
White, yeah.
White, and they would change things, and the director would note down where his cameras were going to be for each bit.
He wouldn't note those down initially. They'd do the thinking work, if you like, on it. And you just had to note things like moves downstage right or takes cup of tea. There were no moves in the script unless they were needed by the story, or something like falls off edge of cliff or something like that. They were a wonderful invention, whoever did it. The scripts were typed on a sheet which had two skins to it, if you like. It was like a double stencil, they were called. And so they would then peel off the top one, and that would be used to print all the rehearsal scripts for everybody. Mm-hmm. And then later on, when the director had rehearsed enough and was writing his script, he would write that with the production secretary, would help as well. He would write all those moves on the cameras, what would be his camera script, which was typed on the second skin, which had already been typed, which saved you typing a 60-page script twice, if you see what I mean. Then they'd run off the yellow studio script from that. So it was quite a job.
Yes. Another job that the AFM had to do was, of course, action props. Now, the action props would have been presumably the real thing.
Yeah. I was thinking just recently of that terrible case in America where somebody actually got shot.
Oh, yeah.
If you had guns, they were always a bit of a problem because you had to have an armourer out with you. And you had to watch them, to really make sure that they didn't go walkies or anything like that. So that was important in that respect. And all the other things you had to make sure, or one thing you had to make sure they didn't have product names on them, so you weren't advertising OXO cubes or something like, Kellogg's cornflakes. If cornflakes featured in the story, you'd have to make sure that the graphics department made you up a nice box of graphics cornflakes, probably with somebody's name on it that everybody knew, but of course the viewers didn't. And I can remember we made some marvellous termite powder once that came into a story. But you never knew what you were going. You became an expert on these things, and you'd say, "Oh no, you can't use that one. That didn't come in until 10 years later if it was a historical play."
Yes. So a designer would be there as well.
Yeah, I always remember, as far as props went, James Kethlen-Jones, who was a wonderful director to work with, he had a marvellous theory. He said, if it's a period piece, get a horse in, he'd say, because they filled up a lot of the screen and looked period. And I did a play with him, and we had rioting miners, coal miners, Welsh coal miners in the studio, and a couple of horses, and it looked very good, I thought. Of course, whether it would look very good now, I don't know.
Yes, that's the interesting question, isn't it? I mean, at the time, everyone thought this was amazing, but if you looked at the thing nowadays, it would probably look very creaky.
Yes, and you hear the cables moving across the ground and things like that. If you watch an old play, I did fairly recently watch a play for today, and that seemed incredibly old in some ways, but it was still brilliant, absolutely brilliant for the performances. So, one made up for the other.
Yes. Were you doing any live dramas, live studio dramas?
I think the only live dramas I did were 30-minute theatres, and that was quite scary because as AFM, you were on the book in the studio, and you had what was called the cut key, which was a little button on a long string in your hand. And if somebody died, you put your finger on the button, which cut out the whole of the studio sound. And you call out, "Dinner is served," or whatever the line is.
Really?
And release your finger hurriedly. And if you did it quick enough, nobody would know. I only had to prompt once, I think. And I just prompted the key word, praying, and it worked. And nobody, in fact, noticed that we, cut the sound out. So it was brilliant.
How very interesting.
But,
yes, those half-hour dramas, I think, they were BBC Two dramas, weren't they? A lot of them.
They were marvellous opportunities for new directors. And I have always tended to be given to new directors and people to sort of look after them, if you like. Yeah. And I worked with Piers Haggard on his first one, and Robert Knights on his first ever, which was, both of them was 30-minute theatres.
Yes.
And
what about Ken Loach?
Yes, that was on Up the Junction, and was the first or second show I ever worked on.
Ah, yes.
And I always remember meeting him because I was sent up to an office in the East Tower Television Centre. Very green I was in those days. And it was on the 12th floor, I remember that. And he was a very quiet chap, lovely man, very quiet chap. And he first thing he said to me, he said, "Have you got a needle and thread?" And of course I'd been told to have everything in your bag you could possibly need under any emergency. And so I said, "Oh yes," I said, "I've got a needle and cotton." I said, "I'll get it out," I said, "and what colour?" I said, "and do dark or light?" I mean, there wasn't a great choice. I said, "No, I'll sew it for you." And he said, no. He said, "It's all right, I'll do it." I said, no. We went on like that. Anyway, he went off with the needle and cotton. And it turned out the button had come off the top of his trousers. And he didn't want me sewing that on. But which shows you how old it was with the buttons on trousers. Yes. But that sort of happened, and he was always thinking of new things when we were filming. And John Mackenzie was his PA, and of course John Mackenzie went on to be a director in his own right, and he was a lovely chap too. And that was very much at the beginning, so I was, I think, the second AFM, which was quite unusual to have two AFMs. But on filming, it was pretty necessary because you never quite knew what was going to happen next.
Yes.
And you could be sent off to sort something out while the other AFM helped out on the actual filming.
Were you involved with on studio days with things like costume, makeup? Did you have to deal with them?
Not really, no. There were always, really good costume designer, and as far as continuity went, the production secretary watched that as much as did the costume assistants themselves, as well as the costume designers.
Yes.
And makeup, they looked after. Oh, the only time I did make up somebody was in the year of the Sex Olympics, which was a marvellous, absolutely marvellous play in 1968. We did a lot of filming at Ealing Studios, and at one point there was an actor up the top of a long ladder at the sort of gantry height, and they said his legs were too shiny and they wanted the makeup lady to go up the ladder and powder him down a bit. And she didn't like heights, so you can guess who ended up going up there with a large powder puff.
Yes.
That was the play that kind of foresaw the way television was going to go, supposedly set in the future, where television shows were people eating too much or having sex. That's all the programme was, really. And we had some lovely fights with custard pies. And Michael Elliott got, I don't think they were credited, I don't know, got all his old mates from the Royal Exchange Theatre to come down and take part in the custard pie throwing episode. So that was good. And we also filmed it on the Isle of Man, and they had this idea that they would have a programme, this was in the story, they'd have a programme where they got a family, husband, wife and child, and put them on an island, and you watch them with cameras round the place to see how they survived. And just to jolly things along a bit, they also put on the island a maniac to sort of haunt them. And a lot of programmes now, I think, I know where they got that idea from. But I had a lovely afternoon on the roof of an old cottage on the shore, and Michael Elliott wanted a sort of Hitchcock shot of seagulls coming in. So I went up on the roof with a bucket of fish heads. Don't say they were cod, but they were fish heads. And there I was, ducked down, hiding, throwing these fish heads out, trying to attract the seagulls to get them come down.
Did it work?
Yeah, it was brilliant. I smelt of fish for about 3 days afterwards.
What were the most memorable plays you think you did?
I think Year of the Sex Olympics and Up the Junction, and also another play called A Choice of Evils, which was about the Pope and one of his cardinals during the war. And it was about a fairly well-known incident in Rome when local partisans lay in wait for a troop of German soldiers and then shot them or blew them up. And there were about 32 of them, I think, killed. And the local German in charge said, right, for every German killed, we're going to kill 10 hostages. And eventually they took them out to the Ardentine caves near Rome and killed them all. And supposedly one of these hostages was a priest who was a friend of the cardinal in the play. The cardinal trying to save his friend if he would only renounce all his views which were not popular. Yeah. Very electrifying. And at the end of one of the scenes, everybody clapped. It was just brilliant.
Yeah.
But every play was memorable in its own way for something
Sure.
or other. Yeah.
Now, you must feel very sad about the end of studio drama.
Yes, in one way, but I think it's wonderful that you can, if they only combine them more, the modern and the old, which they do to a certain extent, and where you can do a long play in a real location, I think that works as well. But certainly there isn't the amount of studio that, there's basically no studio drama anymore.
No.
It's all over to the film people.
Yes, other than EastEnders or something like that.
Yeah,
And of course, the rate of cutting, I believe the average length of a shot now is 4 seconds,
Oh,
which is fairly horrendous.
well, some of it, I mean, is even worse. You get, oh, I know what film I was. I was watching the film of Les Miserables. And in some of the sequences, the shots are probably half a second. You know, they're really so fast. You can't, I don't think, take them in, some of them. I think you can go too fast, and also it can break up the atmosphere in a scene if you cut too much.
Yeah.
Or when, you know, the camera starts going round someone. In the old days, we used to say, oh gosh, not another man in a fireplace, which was when you'd get a shot, a director would think, oh, this is arty, and he'd have a shot with the flames of the fire in the foreground and the scene taking place in the background.
Yes.
And it made you feel that the camera was on fire or something like that. Or they'd open a kitchen cupboard and you'd be in the kitchen cupboard.
Yes.
Occasionally, I think they still do it.
Oh, yes. Now, you did go on to work with a person I worked with for a while, Mark Patterson.
I think he was the loveliest man I ever worked with. He was absolutely brilliant. And he was the energy behind Children in Need. BBC Children in Need had been a radio appeal since about, I think it was 1927. And he was the energy behind getting it on television, with Peter Morpurgo, Michael's brother, actually directing it. But the first one, I was in documentary features, which is where he was working. And I'd worked with him doing programmes, directing programmes on bridge and chess. And he had this idea, and that we should all raise money. It was aimed to do it down at a hotel on the Rhode Island in the centre of Hammersmith one-way system. All sorts of people agreed to come in and help and do it. And as the years went on, everybody would help. It was amazing the help you got. But that first year, I think we raised £600,000 and thought, gosh, isn't this fantastic, you know? But he was also behind trying to get somebody to do all the work of souvenirs, you know, sort of Pudsey Bear cuddly toys and mugs with Pudsey Bear on them and things like that. And that all originated from the graphics designer who'd been asked to come up with a sort of logo for Children in Need. And the original one had just been a group of children seated playing with a ball or something.
Yes.
And anyway, the graphic designer, and sorry to say I can't remember her name, but she came up with the teddy bear with the scarf over his head. Mm-hmm. And the name of Pudsey. She was the one who had the name of Pudsey because that was where she'd been brought up in, is it Leeds? Where Pudsey is.
There's a place called Pudsey, yes.
That's it. So that was where the name came from. But the scarf originally had triangles on it, not circles. And so we got the bear, and then there were some posters and things that Mark wanted. And he had a company that didn't actually have a graphics designer, but were prepared to take on doing all the work of making mugs and things like that. And one of the guys there drew the teddy bear, and with the blocks in front, toy blocks, bricks, with Children in Need on the front of the blocks in front of it. Yes. But it didn't look very professional, if you know what I mean. And I just happened to know my brother was publishing a magazine in Covent Garden, and he had a friend who was an artist. And so I went up to Covent Garden with the picture, and he tarted it up for us. That was how that started. So it was lovely being in the beginning.
Yes.
And then as the years went on, it just got bigger and bigger. The amount raised, and the things that people got up to do it. And I was sort of ended up with the job that on the night I would sit in a little bunker, as it was known, which was the conference room 209, B209.
B209, many a happy, yes.
Behind the South Lifts.
Many script conferences in there.
That's it. Well, I sat in there with a coffee machine and various odds and ends. And if anything went wrong anywhere, they rang me. And also anybody who was wandering around on the night, be it a director of television or whatever, used to wander in for a cup of coffee or something like that. So it was great. But I think the best thing was the Radio 1 DJs had a competition amongst themselves that on the night they would see who could get to television centre in the most unusual way. But unfortunately, they hadn't told us about it. And so the first I heard was during the afternoon when the guy at the front gate, it's probably Vic, rang through and said, "Linda," he said, we've got a Centurion tank at main gate. What shall I do with it?" And I was a little lost for an answer because I was rather thinking if it comes in, it's got to go to reception. And how strong is the road because the cashiers are underneath it. And so I had to just find somewhere to park a tank until the evening, and also about 20 or 30 soldiers that came with it. But and you think, oh, thank God, I got rid of, sorted that. And the next thing that happened was somebody said, "Oh, there's this big van just down Wood Lane. It's causing absolute havoc with the traffic." And it had got an elephant in it. And that was another one of their ideas. But nobody had thought to get a licence for it because an elephant is technically a wild animal. And to cut a long story short, we had to turn him away because he couldn't come onto the BBC property without a licence. So it was very sad.
An elephant licence? I've never heard of an elephant licence.
Well, it's not. Well, it's not.
Well, it's a wild
animal. It's
animal.
A wild
Wild
animal. That's
animal
it.
licence.
Yeah.
Yes.
And funnily enough, only a few weeks after there was an incident down in Eastbourne when somebody did get trampled by an elephant. I think sort of, if you get your foot trodden on by an elephant,
yes.
You certainly know it.
Yeah.
But,
now, its health and safety became much more of a thing, didn't it, at the end of the 90s, I think. I'm not saying people were cavalier before that, but the idea of having to fill out hazard assessment forms and
that's it.
All that business. Did that come to you as well?
Yeah, that was the sort of floor manager used, or on filming or wherever. We did a science fiction play once, and a giant spider caught fire out on the lot at Ealing, and that was great, filling in the form about what had caught fire, large spider, and things like that. And we did another show in the studio with a whole load of scaffolding and with large tanks up on the scaffolding, and studio management, who were overall in charge of health and safety, were crawling all over us beforehand about, get this done or that done, and you must make sure it's this, that and the other. And when we came into the studio, it was at the weekend, and they were probably there, but we never saw anybody come and check out the actual thing in the studio. So that night when we finished recording, we went into the South Hall at Television Centre and got some tape, and on the floor of the South Hall, at the foot of all enormous staircase which goes up 6 floors, we outlined a body on the floor as if they'd fallen over the edge of the scaffolding. Very silly, but we just envisaged the people coming in on Monday morning and finding that there and thinking, my godfathers, what's happened at the weekend? But one does silly things at times, and probably after a few gin and tonics or something like that.
Well, Well, I was wondering how you moved on from drama. I think you ended up doing Points of View, didn't you, or something like
Oh,
that?
that was simply to fill in. I eventually took voluntary redundancy because I'd done in documentary features. I'd initially gone there to help out when they were doing drama documentaries. They had the experience of the documentary side of it, but they wanted help with the drama side of it. And I worked with the lovely John Bird, lovely man, and Ben Ree and Frank Cox, who directed stuff for them. That took up quite a bit of time. Who else was there? Oh, we did a lovely documentary on Lord Byron that Freddie Raphael wrote. Frederick Raphael, who wrote and got an Oscar for the screenplay of the film Darling.
Yes.
He was a fascinating man to work with. It was lovely. And we had a lovely trip all over Europe filming where Byron had been. So if Byron was there, then I was possibly there. But the biggest disappointment was when we actually went to a place in Greece called Messaloniki, where Byron died. And we got out of the minibus on the first day, looked around and decided that that was really the best thing to do if you came to Messaloniki, was drop dead. There was nothing else to do. The piles of rubbish and things like that. It was a fascinating programme to work on.
But I think you ended by doing something with Anne Robinson.
Yes, it was great fun actually. I enjoyed it. We sort of hit it off. I don't know if the guy was on holiday who normally did it or what, but they just wanted somebody to fill in. So as I had a few months to run before I was due to leave the BBC, they said, would I go and do that? So I did. And I did my last studio. I mean, there wasn't much to do in the studio. You just sort of said cue and off they went. And you just hoped you'd spelt everything correct on all the graphics in it. Anne Robinson was the end of my career. She was probably the end of a lot of people's career. But she was quite right in a way, because she would say, well, I'm the one sitting in front of the camera, and if something's wrong, they'll blame me. It doesn't matter what it was. And I think she felt very exposed,
Yes,
as
yes.
it were.
And of course, she had a prickly on-camera persona, of course.
I actually enjoyed working with Anne Robinson. It kept you on your toes. And also, it wasn't an extremely difficult job as such. You know, it was only a small studio. So it was quite a nice way to slowly sink out of the BBC and quietly leave it up and running to all the new people who would come in and take over the BBC and take it in whatever direction they wanted to.
It looks as if you had a very enjoyable time, really.
I did. I miss the people, I think, more than anything. So many of the closest people I worked with seemed to die off as soon as they left the BBC, which is most unusual.
Well, I think you've given us a lot of insights into, particularly into what an AFM does. I thought that was very, very interesting.
I think in a whole load of industries, it must be that, you know, things change and change a fairly big way. And the way that programmes have changed on the BBC, and especially now, a lot of people say, gosh, there's nothing to watch. And when you look in the Radio Times, it's all cheap, what I call cheap shows that are amateurs. They're not professionals who are just being watched by the cameras.
Yes.
And who take me back to my days on the year of the Sex Olympics. And think, yeah, they're doing just what they said, you know, and it's all going that way. So I leave other people to do Love Island and things like that.
Yes.
I wouldn't have wanted to work on it myself.
Well, Linda, thank you very much for doing this. Enjoyed doing it.
It's been a pleasure. Nice talking to you too, David.